All right, in our next demonstration of painting, we're going to do speed painting on top of our flat color layer. And this is really all we need underneath. So I'm going to make a new layer on top. I'm going to call this the speed painting layer. You can also just think of it as a roughed in version of the painting. In oil painting, it's often called scumbling, because we're going to work with kind of a bristly brush very quickly. And the first thing I have to do is I have to customize a brush. So far I've just been using a standard pressure sensitive brush that the harder you press, the thicker it gets. But under these brush settings, which you can find under Window Brush, you can play with this. The problem is this just starts with a basic circle, but there are different techniques we can add. Something called scattering, which makes the brush kind of turn into a sputtering paint can. And then there are some other options we can put into it. But instead of using just a circle, you have a lot of brushes that I've imported into your different terminals. There are also several that come with Photoshop as defaults. So for instance, with CS5, you'll have brushes like this, fan brushes. I'll paint with some black just so you can see. And depending on their opacity or the way you tilt them, they can make lots and lots of different marks. The options you have for them are just the size. You can't tell them to be hard or soft because obviously they're pretty complex shapes. But you can change their opacity. And you can also change their shape dynamics somewhat. So if I want an angle jitter on it, I can have it rotate on itself so much it's almost like a pastel or charcoal powder. And then some effects are going to be about how they overlap with each other. If you do wet edges, you'll get this strange kind of textural effect on it. So these are the different options these brushes have. What it's showing you here is what's called tilt dynamics, and on certain tablets you can change the angle of the brush by how you tilt it. But you notice there's not a lot of pressure difference here. And they have various brush tips for this kind of thing. So this is more of like a Sumi ink brush. It'll be rough on the edges and smooth on the inside. And then the rounded tip brush. This is more like a classic, like number 8 round, though you can change the size. Bristle brush, hog hair brush in oil painting. So this is actually a pretty nice go-to brush, but again, you don't have shape dynamics going small to thick. So what you can do is also make your own brush. So what we're going to do is make our own brush. The last brush I made was one like this, right? And so the way you make a brush basically is you make a pattern and then you play with its shape dynamics, its scattering. And shape dynamics is my actual favorite one to play with. And you can decide how much it angles, how round it gets, and how to control each of these things. So I'll almost always change the size based on pressure, so I can go thick to thin. But first we have to just make the shape of our brush. It's like a stamp. So I'm going to open up a new Photoshop file, and I'm just going to make it fairly small, about 200 by 200 pixels. Because you're putting in pixels, it doesn't matter what the resolution is. It'll just give you the pixels. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a regular brush, just so you can see it, and make it really small. The smaller you design your brush and are happy with it, the more versatility it will have. And I'm just going to do kind of a really kind of random pattern that kind of looks like a diversity of different little hairs hitting the paper with ink. So that's my brush. It's good to have it slightly organic on the outside. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that very simple Photoshop file and I'm going to go to Edit and I'm going to say Define Brush Preset. And I click that and then I name my brush. I'll call it Carl Brush Sample 3 and say OK. And now I'm going to set my shape dynamics for it. I'm going to set my size jitter to be based on pin pressure. I'm going to set the angle jitter, which means how much does it change angle each time I use it, to about there. Whoop, get it to stay. And I want to control that by pin tilt. And then the roundness jitter, I'm pretty happy with it, but if I want to control that, I can do it with what's called pin rotation. But that's only supported by certain styluses, and I don't have that right now, so I might as well just turn it off. I can also set what the minimum roundness is, and that's kind of the softness of the edges of each one. All right, then I'm going to say File, Save. And I'm going to save it to my desktop as my sample brush 3, because sometimes it won't keep a brush in the presets until after you've saved the file at least once. Okay, now I can go back to my speed painting, and when I go to my brushes, if I go all the way to the end, I will see a new brush in there, and it will be the one I just designed. And I have, with each brush shape I choose, I have the ability to change all its dynamics. So if I click on the shape dynamics, it will remember all my settings. And now I have a brush I want to use for my speed painting. Kind of a nice all-in-one brush. Now I start my speed paintings with basically 100% or very close to 100% opacity. And I want a size that's nice and big, because I can change the size based on my pin pressure, because I turned on a size jitter based on pin pressure. So, how do we start this speed painting? Well, I just kind of pick a shadow shape, and I start going crazy. I know my basic shapes are on the top or underneath everything, so I don't need to worry about it. And pretty much I'll just be stealing all my shapes from myself. I'm going to take the opacity down a little bit so I get more color variations as I overlay these things. And this is kind of like duotone coloring. I'm trying to find the shadows on top of these flat colors. It's really great to steal your color from an actual photo instead of a digital painting like I'm forced to. And the reason for that is because you'll see a lot more unexpected colors. I'm going to have to kind of build in some unexpected colors here, I think. So some blues in the hair. The nice thing about using kind of a scumbly, rough-edged brush is I don't need to worry so much about the shapes. And that's why I have the flat painting underneath to kind of contain my shapes a little bit, so I can be a little looser and more creative with my shadows. And what I love doing is kind of overlaying these colors, like the browns and the blues, and then the highlights, putting them back in. And notice I'm not zooming in at all yet. I want to get kind of full coverage before I start zooming in and trying to finish off certain areas. So get his jawline in there, get his mouth. And the more comfort you have with painting, the easier this will feel. But this is a painting technique that's very much taken out of oil painting. And then when we do more refinements, we'll be maybe using some other kind of blending techniques more similar to acrylic or watercolor, where we're softening some of these edges of this scumbly brush. Now notice if I turn off my flat color layer, you'll see what these brush effects look like. And they look very much like they're just painted by a traditional method. But when you get close enough, you'll just see that it's the overlaying of all of my different custom brush strokes. So this is not the way it's supposed to look when it's finished. We want it to look however we stylize it to look. So in the end, I might take my organizing kind of flat colors. I'll go ahead and label that layer so we can keep track of it. I might take it out completely and it will be replaced. What is hard is I want to make sure I do a portrait of Mark Twain and not Albert Einstein. And that kind of careful understanding of the shapes is going to help me keep the likeness instead of just being a lot of textures. Because right now it's looking a lot like Albert Einstein too. All right, so I keep building. I'm really working with a very limited palette here, just browns and blues. I have to put his pipe in. With the customized brush, it's impossible to get an exact shape, so I just kind of place it and I'll be able to cut it out later. And it's very important to my processing with speed painting never to zoom in, just to try to fill the whole thing as much as I can. Now, even areas like his white shirt, I want to try to find some color content there. Chromatic grays. You want to really limit your solid whites for dramatic effect later. So largely with the speed painting, I'm just trying to get rid of all the whites, replace them with something to react with later. Don't worry about going beyond the edges of your image. That's what it's there for. We're going to use all the advantages we can of digital art. And being able to alter the composition after the fact is one of those big advantages we don't want to lose. A black, just like in a painting course, you'll learn that black paint is a very dangerous thing. It's much better to mix your black out of other colors. And so when I use it, I'm always sure it's at a low opacity, and I'm just mixing it with the colors that are there. But it is important to pretty early on establish your darkest values, so you don't spend too much time working with values that are altogether too light and not potent enough. So I'm going to make sure I have some strong darks in there. Basically in all the different textures. You can always lighten up as well. Okay, so that's my speed painting. Now from here, I'm not going to worry too much about the details of buttons, cufflinks, eyelashes, eyelids, wrinkles. On the speed painting layer, much better to deal with that when you're more zoomed in and are using kind of a more refined touch with your brushes, paying more attention to these shapes, right, to get it to look the way you want. So that will be the next step. And for that, I'm going to use a tool called the Navigator, which you'll find under Window, so that I can always see it full scale and then very easily zoom in on different parts and move around. So that's my speed painting, and that finishes the next step of the demo.